A dwindling value list is one that shrinks as choices are made. It's common in a reservation system where once an item is reserved on a particular day or time, it can't be reserved by somebody else. In this example, we're going to use tables. A table can be reserved only once per day. Now this is a very simple example. Yours is probably going to be much more complex, but I wanted to distill it down to just the core technique. So I made it very simple. There's no people involved here. There's only tables, and the tables only have numbers. And it could get much more complicated, but once you understand the core functionality, you can apply it to your unique scenario. Now I actually have three techniques here. You can see the list technique, execute SQL, and set field. Now I'm showing three techniques because they all have their advantages and disadvantages, and you really should analyze them for your particular unique scenario. You want to make sure that the advantages each one of these has applies to what you're trying to do, because not every scenario is the same. So we'll try to point out the most general advantages and disadvantages, but it's really up to you to look at your situation and go, okay, I'm doing this, and this one does this. Maybe it won't work so well here, and I want to go with this other technique. It's really one of the best ways you can make a really solid FileMaker system by analyzing what a solution does and how it can best do it. So let's take a look at how this works by demoing it a little bit. We're going to start with the list. I'm going to simply see that there's only 2 and 3 here. 1 has been removed already. I'll choose 2, and you'll notice that the 2 comes down here, and now when I pop up the menu, I only have 3. As soon as I choose 3, it goes down here. Now you can see the execute for SQL's updating here, right? But the set field's not working. That's because I have to run this one from here to make it work correctly, because it runs a script. These ones are all live calculations with refreshes, so it'll work independently. This is one of the advantages of these methods. They're live calculation fields, so no matter where you add in these reservations, even outside this interface, they'll update. But the thing about this is the core functionality of all these is the same, and it's based on these fields right here. Now this one isn't updated to 1, 2, 3, but we'll show you working later. What it's doing is making what's called a multi-key. That's a return separated list of values. Normally, if you use a field inside of a relationship as a key field, it matches on the entire value. As soon as you add a return in here, or any number of returns, it treats each one of these as a separate match value. Think of it as 1 or 2 or 3 in this case. So let's go into Manage Database and take a look at this stuff. So what we're going to do is first look at the fields here. We're not going to look at how they work, but there's the exclude list, exclude SQL, and you can see this one's a regular field. Now what these do is make these return separated lists, which are used in 3 different relationships. They're essentially really the same, but I made 3 different ones so we could have them work separately. And you'll see the first one for list simply uses exclude list and says whatever's in this list, find out which ones it doesn't equal, and basically exclude those from my choice in the value list. Same here, except we're using exclude SQL, and same here with this one down here. We're just using the set field one. So let's take a look at the value list. Let's go into Manage Value Lists, and they're all essentially the same. They're conditional value lists. The key here is we're including values, but not all values. We're going from days to tables list. So I was saying whatever's in days in that table occurrence, go across that relationship and only show those values. So if we look at days table list, or if we look at days tables SQL, and so on, or look at this one, which is the table set field, those are the relationships we just showed you in Manage Database. So these relationships from here to here and here to here are what controlling what's in that conditional value list. In other words, the value list is based on the relationship. So each time we exclude a value, the value list or the pop-up menu gets shorter. And we do that through this calculation if we're looking at the first technique. It says, and really all you want to look at first is this portion right here. Forget about the outside portion. This is really the brains of it. And it says, look across this relationship. It says, look from days over to reservations and give us a list of all the values. So if we look over here and look over to here, what we do is we see whatever's inside that portal, because that reservations right there is attached to this portal right here. The layout's based on days, so it's from days to reservations, and we're from KP to KF days. So whatever's in there, 1, 2, 3, that's what's going to appear here. That's what that list function does. It always returns it in a return separated list. Now, what the problem is if we leave it empty when there's no choices, is that it will not pop up the menu with 1, 2, and 3. It'll just say no values because there's nothing inside here. And if you have a blank, a match field, then what it's going to do is not be able to match at all, and it's going to give you, no match at all. So what we do is if we see that there's nothing inside of the reservations table, then we result in a 0. And 0, is no table number, so we don't have to worry about that. That matches nothing, so it excludes nothing and shows everything, in other words. So that's pretty cool. Now with this technique, we have to have some refreshing going on. You'll see that if we go to layout mode and we look at our script triggers on here, either command or control click depending on your platform, you can see it on object modify refresh the list. So every time we modify this choice here, it's going to refresh the list. And we also have this row delete list here. We'll take a look at that as well. You need to run some refreshing then as well. If you don't refresh, then it's not going to update properly. In other words, this will update or not depending on whether you have the refresh or not, and not necessarily update this. In fact, you can see what happens if we decide not to run these. So we'll come into our refresh list. You'll see that what it does is it commits the record and refreshes the window. Well, if we go ahead and take these off temporarily, just run them out, and pop this up, you'll see first of all there's none in there, so we'll delete that one first. And you'll see that the 1, 2, 3 hasn't updated here. I can get it if I click outside the portal, it updates. But then if I go ahead and see it's not updated here, I have to go up to refresh window. And then once I do that, it should appear. Now I can see it's there, but it doesn't necessarily update elsewhere. So you've got to watch out about that. You see there's still a 3 in there. So that's what that refreshing is all about. So the refresh list requires quite a bit of refreshing. It doesn't just need a refresh window. You also have to commit the records and essentially move out of the portal. That helps to refresh this whole thing. So I'll save that. We'll look at our row delete. It simply does a little message, and if it's true, they say yes, I want to delete it, deletes it, and then performs that same script we just looked at. Now we also have the execute SQL. Works on the same principle, a live calculation. If we go into Manage Database, and if you're familiar with the execute SQL, then you're going to understand that this is a select statement. What's saying here, and I'm not going to go over this completely because this is not an exercise about just execute SQL. You can look up that, but I'll give you the basics here. It's going to say select this field. Now I had to put it in the quote function because it begins with an underscore, and SQL doesn't like underscores. So if I do this with the quote function, it allows this reserved character, the underscore. But really what I'm looking for is this. In the reservations table where KF days equals KP days. So essentially what it's going to go ahead and do here is take a look at this table, the reservations table, really the same thing we're doing with the list function, right? And it's going to say, okay, why don't you get all of the KF table IDs, the 1, 2s, and the 3s, whenever this primary key matches this foreign key over there. So it gives me a return separated list. Pretty simple stuff. So what we also do here is do the same thing to make sure there's a value in there, a 0, and this is really the same as the list function. But if you understand execute SQL, it's very basic stuff, but that's about as much as I'm going to go over it. What you need here in this example, why I included, is it doesn't need quite as much refreshing. So if we look at the script, we'll see it only needs a refresh window. And when you look at this delete, it's the same thing, but runs the refresh SQL. So that's one of the cool things about it. Now, when we're working with this one, let's go ahead and delete some of these values here so we can get this one up to date. You see how this one, we work this one over here, you can see it updates that return separated list. That's perfect. You just have to run the script. So it's running a script that's a little bit different. You'll see that if we come in here, it's running that refresh set field. Of course, execute SQL ran a different script as well, but I wanted to point that out. So if we go into script workspace, we'll see that refresh set field simply sets that field, and that field meaning this exclude field right here, to the same value that was in the execute SQL live calculation. Exactly the same thing. The difference is it doesn't need a refresh at all. Why? Because you're setting that field that's used inside the relationship. This field right here is actually used right inside the relationship. And so when you touch that or modify that field, it automatically updates the relationship. The same is not true with the live calculation. It doesn't necessarily update just because it's recalculated. It's only when you touch that field with a set field or actually type it in there that it'll cue that relationship to update. And that's why we don't need a refresh. So there's one of the advantages. It doesn't need a refresh. That's pretty cool stuff. Now, with the execute SQL, it's a little bit more complex. Not as easy to explain as a list function, but it doesn't need as much refresh as the list function. So there you go. There's 3 different methods. Which one you choose depends on what concept you're more familiar with, which one works better in what situation, how you're going to be adding fields. Maybe you're only adding fields from this interface. Well, then you can be sure that the set field worked because it's always going to be running those script triggers. But if you might be adding them, let's say, from a website as well, the reservations, well, maybe you don't have quite the same interface and you can't get it to update properly. So you might want to use the list or the execute SQL. It's really up to you. It depends on what your solution calls for.